30 seconds ago, he was pulling a child from under an overturned bus. Then a tanker truck carrying gasoline exploded. And now he's kneeling in a stranger's body in the middle of a stone hall. And 40 armed women are staring at him as if they were facing either a god or the plague. The cold comes first, not winter's chill, the kind that comes from within, as if someone had ripped all the warmth out of him at once. Then the sound hits him, a low rumble. Dozens of women's voices speaking a language Dan Han has never heard before, and he understands every word. He opens his eyes and sees living fire, dozens of torches in the hands of women in leather armor, tattoos on their faces, scars on their bare shoulders. They stand in a semicircle, their eyes fixed on the 18-year-old boy on his knees. His arms are thin, the body is foreign. His eyes burn silver, and he knows this not because he sees himself, but because everyone around him is looking at him as if he were a god or a plague. And then 18 years of someone else's memories crash into his head like a bucket of ice water. A slave mother, death in childbirth, a child with silver eyes whom no one dared to touch. 18 years of equal parts contempt and fear. A name, Dayan, a half-breed, the son of a slave from the coast, and a shaman, the only male shaman in a world where only women are born as shamans. Dan swallows hard. His throat is dry, his body is shaking, but his mind is already working. 4 years of emergency training have drilled one thing into him. When everything goes to hell, you don't panic. You assess the situation. A stone hall, torches, 40 warriors, spears, knives, bows on their backs. Not a single man besides him. In the center, on a stone platform, sits a woman who stands out from the rest like a commander from the rank and file. Tall, broad-shouldered. A scar runs from her temple to her chin. Eyes heavy as wet stone. Niobe, chiefess of the Wei Sharan tribe, daughters of the Red River. 300 female warriors, 50 male porters, and not a single shaman for 12 winters in a row. Dayan's memory prompts him. Today is the Council of Elders. Today they dragged him here to decide, to recognize the gift or not, to accept a male shaman or not. There has never been such a thing. Not a single legend of a man at the drum. Not a single name. It is impossible. And yet he stands here, with silver eyes and a gift that every woman in the hall senses. To the right of Niobe, a gaunt old woman with gray braids sits hunched over. Her hands are dark and gnarled like roots. Orsha, the senior herbalist. For 12 years, she has held the tribe's medicine in her hands. She heals as best she can. She sings over the wounded. She beats the drum. She buries those she could not save. And she stares at Dan with such hatred that he feels it on his skin, like the heat from a fire. To the left, 3 warriors in full armor stand frozen. The tallest one has a red knot at the nape of her neck and 2 knives with handles made from someone's teeth. Karen, the best spearwoman. She looks at Dan as if he were an insect that has crawled onto the battlefield. Niobe speaks. Her voice is low and steady, the voice of one who has been giving orders for 20 years and is used to them being obeyed. The spirits have sent a sign. On the longest night, a slave girl from the coast gave birth to a boy with silver eyes. The boy has grown. His gift is genuine. 3 herbalists have confirmed this independently. Now the council must decide to accept him as a shaman or to reject him. If they accept him, for the first time in the history of Isanur, a man will stand at the drum. If he is rejected, Wei Sharan will enter its 13th winter without a shaman. And everyone in the hall knows that the tribe might not survive the 13th winter. The silence is so thick that Dan hears the crackling of the torches, the howl of the wind beyond the walls, the beating of a stranger's heart in a stranger's chest. And then he does what no man in the history of Wei Sharan has ever done. He rises from his knees, slowly, not with the jerky movement of a slave who has been allowed to stand, calmly, like a man who knows his worth. He straightens his back, looks Niobe straight in the eyes, and bows. Not like a slave, like an equal. A whisper ripples through the hall. Someone's hand rests on the hilt of a knife. Corinne takes half a step forward, but Niobe raises her palm and the whispering dies down. She looks at him for a long time. Something changes in her gaze. For 18 years, she had watched this boy crawl through the mud among the plague-ridden, how he was pushed and shunned. She had seen the empty silver eyes of a frightened child. And now, standing before her, is someone. With the straight back and calm gaze of one who has seen things far more terrifying than a hall full of armed women. Niobe nods, once, and utters the words that change everything. The council grants him the moon. 1. 30 days. If he proves the gift is real and useful, he will remain with the tribe. If he fails, they will send him to the coast, to the place from which his mother was brought. That is exile. On the coast, a man without a tribe survives a week, maybe 2. Dan bows again, turns around, walks toward the exit. His back is straight, his stride is steady. He steps out into the cold, takes 10 steps on the packed snow, and his legs give way. He collapses against the wall. His hands are trembling. He presses them against his knees. Above his head is a sky he has never seen before. 3 moons, 1 large, pale green one, 2 small, reddish ones. The stars are out of place, not a single familiar constellation. Smoke, damp skin, pine needles, something sweet and heavy from the hot rivers somewhere below. He closes his eyes and goes over what he knows. He is Daniel Kahn, 28 years old. Paramedic, 4 years in an ambulance, 2 years volunteering in the Philippines. He sets dislocations in the back of a rattling pickup. He delivers babies in a tent during a typhoon. He stops bleeding from a femoral artery with 3 fingers and a piece of cloth. And now he is in the body of an 18-year-old half-breed with silver eyes. In a world where women carry spears and men haul loads, in a tribe without a shaman, he has 30 days. He opens his eyes, gets up, dusts off his knees, and goes to look for clean water. Dan spent the first 2 days on reconnaissance, not magical, just the ordinary kind. He walked the entire length and breadth of the Weisharon camp, 112 paces wide, 240 long, 32 yurts made of animal hides and poles, 1 large council hall made of stone, pens for pack animals, something resembling goats but with 6 horns and thick black fur, 3 fire pits, a stream running through the center of the camp, and latrines 20 paces upstream from where the women drew water to drink. Dan stopped by the stream and looked at it for a minute. Then he closed his eyes. Then he opened them. The pits were upstream, the drinking water was downstream. Everything that fell into the pits flowed straight into the mugs and pots. He recalled the epidemiology from his textbook. He recalled Jon Snow. Not the one from the TV show, but the one who, in 1854 in London, stopped the cholera by simply removing the tap handle. Dan couldn't remove the tap handle, but he could remember this and come back to the problem later. He walked on. There was no infirmary in the tribe. The wounded were treated in the Orshi's yurt. Orshi. He peeked inside while the old woman was away. The smell inside made his eyes water. Blood, pus, mold, bundles of dry grass hanging on ropes, a drum made of skin and bone, a pot of some kind of brown sludge, 3 beds made of animal skins. A woman with a bandaged shoulder lay on one of them. The bandage was dirty, dark with dried blood and something greenish. Dan stepped closer. The woman opened her eyes and recoiled. She looked at his silver eyes with the same expression he had seen 50 times over the past 2 days. Fear. Not hostile, superstitious. He raised his hands, palms forward, a universal gesture. I won't touch you. He said he wanted to look at the wound. Just look. The woman hesitated and turned her head away. That was permission. He unwound the bandage. The wound was on her shoulder, a laceration. The edges were inflamed. Red streaks ran from the wound down her arm. The smell was sweetish and rotten. Onset of sepsis. He'd this dozens of times. In the Philippines, in the slums of Manila, in villages where machete cuts were treated with chewed tobacco. This woman would die in 3 or 4 days if nothing was done. He asked how old the wound was. The woman said 7 days ago, a wild boar, hunting. Orsha had treated the wound with ointment and sung over it. Dan nodded. He stepped out of the hut and walked to the stream. He sat down on a rock and began to think. He had no antibiotics, no hydrogen peroxide, no bandages, no suture material. He had none of the things he'd grown accustomed to over 4 years in the ambulance. But he had his hands, and his head, and the knowledge of one simple fact. Most infections in the world before antibiotics killed not because they couldn't be cured, but because no one had thought of the simple things: cleanliness, boiling, drainage, rinsing. He stood up and walked to the nearest campfire. 2 young girls were cooking there. They froze when they saw him. He asked for a pot, a clean one, water, boiling water, a clean cloth, any cloth, and a knife. The girls exchanged glances. One of them left and returned with Karin. The red-haired spearwoman stood a full head taller than him and looked down with an expression usually reserved for dirt on her boots. She asked what he was doing. Dan said that the woman in Orsha's yurt would die in a few days if he didn't help her. Karin said that Orsha was already treating her. Dan said that, with all due respect to Orsha, the treatment wasn't working. Karin said he was a boy who had only just gotten back on his feet 2 days ago and was already climbing into the wounded. Dan said he was a shaman, and that was his job. Karin laughed. Her laugh was sharp as a bark. She said he wasn't a shaman until the council confirmed it. For now, he was just a boy with shining eyes. Dan looked up at her. He weighed about 60 kilograms in this body. Karin weighed probably close to 90, and it was all muscle and bone. He spoke quietly and evenly. If that woman dies, he'll go to the council and say he could have saved her, but they wouldn't let him. And let the council decide who was to blame. Karen stopped laughing. She silently brought him a pot, water, cloth, and a knife, and stood there beside him. Dan boiled the water. He dipped the knife and strips of cloth into it. He waited. He took them out. He let them cool. He returned to Orshi's yurt. He washed the wound with boiled water. The woman screamed. He didn't stop. He lanced the abscess, drained the pus, rinsed it again, applied a clean bandage, bandaged it tightly, told the woman to drink only boiled water, and came back 6 hours later. Rinsed, bandaged, came back another 6 hours later, and again. On the second day, the redness began to subside. On the third, the woman asked for food. Or Orsha came to him on the third day. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She stood in the doorway of his chum and looked at him just as Niobe had looked at the council, with something that was more than anger, with something that resembled fear. She asked how he knew. Dan said the spirits had shown him. Orsha said the spirits don't speak to men. Dan said maybe these spirits hadn't heard of that rule. Orsha turned and left. Karen, standing by the wall, snorted. It was the first time she had made a sound in his presence that wasn't an expression of contempt. On the third day, everything changed, in the evening. Dan sat by his campfire, trying to organize what he knew about local herbs from Diane's memory. Diane knew little. He had grown up on the outskirts of the camp, and no one had taught him anything. But he had seen a few things. The bark of the red tree that people chewed for toothaches, the leaves of the silvery bush that Orsha applied to burns, the root of the black bindweed that was given to women in labor. Dan memorized everything because he had no paper. Then a girl ran up to his campfire. A little girl, about 8 years old, dark hair, her mother's eyes, a scar on her chin. Shira, Niobe's daughter. She said she felt sick, her stomach hurt, badly. Dan looked at her. She was pale, holding her right side. Her forehead was beaded with sweat. He told her to sit down. She sat down. He placed his hand on her forehead. Hot. 38.5 degrees, he estimated. Maybe 39. He told her to lie down. She lay down on the hide by the fire. He began to palpate her stomach. Gently, by quadrants, just as he'd been taught. Upper left, quiet. Lower left, quiet. Upper right, quiet. Lower right. Shira cried out and jerked. McBurney's point, positive. He removed his hand, pressed again, pulled it away sharply. Shira cried out even louder. Schketkin's Bloomberg symptom, positive, acute appendicitis. In the chieftain's 8-year-old daughter, in a world without surgery, without anesthesia, and without antibiotics. He had at most 6 hours before the appendix burst and peritonitis killed the child. Dan closed his eyes for a second, opened them, told Shira not to move. He stood up and walked over to Niobe. Niobe was sitting by the main fire. 3 senior warriors were with her. They were discussing something about pasture boundaries. Dan approached and everyone fell silent. He said that a rotten fetus was growing inside Shira's belly. If it wasn't cut out before dawn, the girl would die. Niobe stood up, slowly. She was a head taller than him. Her face didn't change. She asked how he knew. Dan said he had placed his hands on the child's belly and the spirits had shown him. It was a lie. The spirits hadn't shown him anything. What had been shown to him were 4 years of training and 300 hours of clinical practice. But to these people, there was no difference between a shaman and a doctor. Niobe looked at him. Then she turned to one of the warrior women and told her to bring Orsha. Orsha came quickly. She examined Shira. She felt her stomach. The girl was crying. Orsha straightened up and said that a fox spirit was inside the child. They had to sing the fox's funeral song, and the spirit would leave. Dan said the spirit wouldn't leave because of a song, that the flesh inside the girl was rotting, and she needed to be cut open. Orsha looked at him with fury. She said she had been healing this tribe for 40 years, and no boy would tell her what to do. Dan looked at Niobe. He spoke a single sentence. He said that if they sang, Shira would die by morning. Niobe stood between them. Her daughter lay on the skins, moaning. For 20 years, the chieftain had made decisions on which the lives of 300 people depended. She looked at Orsha. She looked at Dan. And she said one word. Cut. Orsha took a step back. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to object. Niobe repeated, cut, and added that if the girl died, Dan would leave for the coast in the morning. Not in 30 days, in the morning. Dan nodded. He began to prepare. He asked for 20 torches. The light had to be bright and even. He asked for boiling water, 3 pots, clean cloth, as much as they could find. A knife, the best bronze knife in the tribe, a thin one. He asked for a needle, a bone one, the thinnest one, and thread, made from sinew, thin and strong. He asked for fermented juice from the stores, the kind they drank on holidays, strong. They brought him everything in half an hour. Karen stood nearby. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was gray. The whole tribe knew Sheru, a little girl with a scar on her chin who ran between the yurts, dragging a wooden horse on a string behind her. Dan put the knife in boiling water, the needle too, the thread too, the strips of cloth too. He washed his hands with ash, for a long time, thoroughly, up to his elbows. Then he doused his hands with fermented juice. It burned his skin. Good. Alcohol. Not medical grade, of course. 15 to 20 proof at most, but better than nothing. He poured the same juice over Shera's stomach. The girl flinched. He asked Orsha to prepare a poppy decoction, the strongest she could make. Orsha was silent. Then she left silently and returned with a clay cup. Dan brought the cup to Shera's lips and helped her drink. Poppy decoction. An opiate. Not morphine, of course, but for an 8-year-old child, it should be enough to dull the pain and induce a drowsy state. He waited 20 minutes. The girl had quieted down. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing was steady. Niobe stood by the wall, motionless. Dan asked them to start beating the drums. Orsha raised an eyebrow. Dan said the sound would drown out the moans and that the spirits listened to the rhythm of the drum. That was the second lie. The drums were needed so that Shera wouldn't hear her own screams and so that Dan's own hands would stop shaking from the vibration that filled the air. Two herbalists began beating the drums, rhythmically, dully. A rumble filled the yurt. Dan took the knife out of the boiling water. Hot. Good. He looked at the girl's stomach. Small, thin skin. He saw a spot. Between the navel and the right iliac crest. McBurney's line. A McBurney incision. Oblique. 3 or 4 centimeters. Through the skin, through the subcutaneous tissue, through the aponeurosis, through the muscles, the peritoneum. And there was the appendix, inflamed, swollen, ready to burst. He took a breath, exhaled. His hands stopped shaking. 4 years in an ambulance. He'd sutured lacerations in the back of the vehicle while traveling at 70 miles per hour. He delivered babies in a tent during a typhoon. He could do this. He pressed the knife against the skin and began to cut. Shira flinched. She groaned. The drums boomed louder. Blood flowed immediately. He dabbed at it with a cloth. He cut further, layer by layer, slowly. The bronze knife was sharp, but not a steel scalpel. Every movement required a precision he had never achieved before. Through the subcutaneous fat. There was little of it. The child was thin. Through the muscle layer. He separated the muscles bluntly, with his fingers, as he had been taught. Don't cut the muscles. Separate along the fibers. The peritoneum, a thin membrane. He cut it open with the tip of the knife. The smell hit his nose. Hot. Rotten. Not peritonitis. Not peritonitis yet, but on the verge. He found the appendix. Swollen. Dark red. Almost black at the tip. A few more hours and it would have burst. Dan tied off the base of the appendix with a thread of sinew. 2 knots. Tight. He cut it off above the ligature. The appendix fell into the cup he'd held out. A small, dark piece of flesh the size of a pinky finger. A rotten fruit. He didn't throw it away. It was his proof. Now to suture. The peritoneum, with small stitches. A bone needle. 1,000 times rougher than a surgical one, but he tried. Stitch. 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 Muscle layer. Aponeurosis. Subcutaneous tissue. Skin. 17 stitches. He rinsed the suture with boiled water, applied a clean bandage, poured the fermented juice over it once more, straightened up. 40 minutes. His hands were covered in blood up to his wrists. His back ached so badly he could barely straighten up. The drums fell silent. Silence. Everyone was looking at him. Niobe, Orsha, Karen. 12 warrior women who had crowded into the yurt during that time. Shara was breathing, evenly, calmly. The color was returning to her face. Dan held up the cup containing the severed appendix and showed it to Niobe. He said that this was the rotten fruit, that the spirits had shown him the way, that the girl would live. Niobe approached her daughter. She knelt down. She placed her palm on her forehead. Then she turned to Dan. There was something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not surprise. Determination. She turned to the hall and said that the trial was over, that she didn't need 30 days to see what stood before her. Orsha took a step forward. Her voice trembled. She said that this was not right, that the ancestors would not approve, that a man at the drum was a desecration. Niobe stood up and looked down at Orsha. She asked if the ancestors would approve of her daughter's death. Orsha fell silent. Niobe said from this day forward, Dian Silver would be the shaman of Wei Sharan, on probation, until the end of winter, but he would remain, and anyone who laid a hand on him would answer to her personally. Dan stood with a cup in his hand, with blood on his fingers, with pain in his back, and he thought. He had just performed an appendectomy with a bronze knife by torchlight to the accompaniment of tambourines, without anesthesia, no antibiotics, no assistant, no sterile operating room, His mother in Seattle, who had worked as a nurse at Harborview for 30 years, would either be proud of him or she would kill him. The next morning, Shira opened her eyes and asked for food. Dan had sat by her side all night, changed the bandage every 4 hours. He monitored her temperature. He gave her small sips of boiled water. By morning, the fever had broken. The girl looked at him and asked who he was. Dan said he was a shaman. Shira said that shamans aren't boys. Dan said that now they are. Shira thought for a moment and said that then he would be her brother, because she had never had a brother. Dan wanted to object, but he couldn't. He nodded. Orsha stood in the doorway and saw it. She looked at his hands, at the clean bandage, at the child who was supposed to die but didn't. Then the old herbalist slowly knelt before him. Not before his gift, not before the spirits, before his hands. Dan had performed an appendectomy on the chieftain's cherry with a bronze knife and saved her life. Niobe declared him the tribe's shaman until the end of winter. Orsha bowed before him for the first time, acknowledging the result of his work. Shira called him brother. For the next 10 days, Dan worked as he had never worked before. Even during the toughest shifts in Seattle, when they brought in 12 stab wounds and 3 overdoses a night, he could at least hand a patient over to the emergency room and have a cup of coffee. Here, there was no emergency room. There was no coffee. There were no shifts. There was him. And 300 people who were watching him and waiting. The first thing he did was go to Niobe and ask for a separate hut for the infirmary. Not Orshi's tent, a separate one, clean, bright, with access to water. Niobe asked why. Dan said that the sick couldn't be kept near the healthy, that disease spreads through the air and through hands and through dirt. Niobe said that wasn't how it worked, that illness was the wrath of the spirits. Dan said that the spirits were angrier when the sick lay in the dirt. Niobe thought about it. Then she nodded. 2 days later, 4 porters and 6 female warriors built him a hut at the edge of the camp, downstream from the stream, far from the living yurts, with a separate fire pit, with a supply of firewood, with 2 entrances for ventilation. Dan spent another day setting it up inside. Beds, 6 of them, made of fresh hides, a place for tools, a knife, needles, thread, all boiled, a supply of clean cloth for bandages, a pot for boiling, a separate pot for decoctions, a place to store the herbs he was about to gather and catalog. Then he turned his attention to water. That was more important than anything else. He went to the council, the small council, 5 senior warriors and Niobe. He said the latrines needed to be moved, downstream along the creek, much further down from the camp, and drinking water should be drawn further up. Silence. One of the senior warriors named Hagra, a woman with a severed ear and a voice like a rock slide, said that the pits had stood in that spot for 3 generations, that the ancestors had chosen that spot. Dan said that the ancestors didn't know what he knew, that the mud from the pits gets into the water, that the children get sick from this water, that half the illnesses in the camp come from the water. Hagra said that was heresy. Dan said it wasn't heresy, but an observation. He asked how many children had died last winter from stomach aches and diarrhea. Silence. Niobe answered. 4. Dan said they died from dirty water, and that if the pits weren't moved, more would die this winter. Niobe looked at Hagra. Hagra clenched her jaw, but said nothing. The pits were moved 3 days later. Dan stood watching as the porters dug new pits 30 paces downstream from the last chum, far from the water, far from food, far from the children. Karen stood nearby. Niobe had appointed her as Dan's bodyguard after the operation, officially. Karen was furious about it. The tribe's best spearwoman, the one who'd killed 3 boars single-handedly, the one who'd walked the red trail, and now she was a babysitter for a boy who couldn't lift a log. She asked why he needed to move the shit pits. Dan explained, simply, briefly. Dirt in the water, water in the stomach. Pain, death. Karen listened. Then she said it sounded too simple to be true. Dan said the most important things are usually simple. Karen snorted. Then she paused and said that her younger brother had died of stomach pains 4 winters ago. He was 6. Dan didn't say anything. They stood in silence and watched them dig the pits. Then he got to work on the soap. There was no soap in the tribe. There were fragrant leaves used to rub the body before festivals. There was clay from the beds of hot rivers. But there was no soap. Dan knew the recipe. Simple. Ash, fat, water. The lye from the ash reacts with the fat and soap is produced. Rough, odorless, but soap. He asked the porters for ash from the campfires, a whole sack full. He asked the women for fat from the last hunt, goat fat, the kind that wasn't used for food. He boiled the water, poured it over the ash, strained the lye, mixed it with the rendered fat. He simmered it over low heat, stirring a stick. The smell was monstrous. Spectators gathered around the fire. Porters, several young girls, children. Everyone watched as the shaman with silver eyes boiled something brown and stinking in a cauldron. A few hours later, he poured the liquid into a flat mold made of bark. By morning, it had hardened. A brown lump with the texture of rough stone. Soap. He cut it into pieces. He brought one to Karen and asked her to wash her hands. Karen said her hands were clean. Dan said no, that she holds a spear with her hands and touches the ground and scratches her nose, and then uses those same hands to eat. And all the dirt from the spear and the ground and her nose ends up in her mouth. Karen said she'd been eating with her hands for 22 years and hadn't died. Dan said she was lucky, and that her brother was less so. Karen looked at the soap, then at him, then silently washed her hands. The skin on her hands squeaked from the cleanliness. Karen looked at her palms with an expression Dan had seen on children opening presents. She didn't say anything, but she didn't throw the soap in his face either. That was progress. At the same time, Dan began recruiting assistants. He needed hands, lots of hands. He couldn't do everything alone. He asked Niobe for 2 young girls to train. Niobe sent him Leva and Sana. Leva was the 17-year-old daughter of a porter, quiet, neat, with slender fingers and attentive eyes. Sana was the 16-year-old daughter of one of the senior warriors, loud, impatient, with hands that dropped everything. Dan began to teach them, from the very beginning, washing hands, before any contact with the wounded, after any contact, no exceptions, boiling instruments, always, clean bandages, always, how to check a pulse, how to count breaths, how to determine a fever, how to clean a wound, how to bandage, how to recognize an infection, redness, swelling, fever, pain, pus. 5 signs that Celsus described 2,000 years ago and that work the same in any world. Leva remembered everything the first time. Sana mixed up left and right, but both tried their best. Dan taught them every day from dawn to dusk, and every evening he sat alone by the fire, trying not to think about how his life in Seattle was over. That Mom never got that call on Sunday. That someone else had pulled, or hadn't pulled, that child out of the bus. He didn't think about that. He made soap. He boiled bandages. He taught the girls how to take a pulse. And he waited. Because he knew that 30 days wasn't enough. That winter was coming. And that the real trials hadn't even begun yet. Dan built an infirmary and arranged for the latrines to be moved further downstream. He made the tribe's first batch of soap. He began teaching his 2 assistants, Leva and Sana, the basics of medicine. Karen slowly began to change her attitude toward him after a conversation about her deceased brother. Toward the end of the 2nd week, dysentery broke out. The first to fall ill was a child, a 3-year-old boy from the porter's hut. His mother brought him to the infirmary in the morning, pale, hot, watery stool with blood. Dan examined him and felt his stomach clench. He knew what it was. He'd seen it in the Philippines, in a village by Lake Lanao where he'd spent 2 weeks battling an outbreak and lost 2 children. Dysentery. In a world without antibiotics, without IVs, and without rehydration salts, it's a death sentence for the small and weak. He asked the child's mother where she got her water. She said from a stream. He asked if she boiled the water before giving it to the child. She looked at him, not understanding the question. By evening that day, 2 more children. The next morning, 4 more. 2 days later, 12 children in the children's ward, all with the same symptoms: fever, vomiting, bloody diarrhea, dehydration. Dan didn't sleep. He followed protocol. The protocol he'd memorized in the Philippines when WHO volunteers came and showed them how to stop an epidemic in a zero-infrastructure environment. First, quarantine. He went to Niobe and told her that the sick children had to be separated from the healthy ones immediately, that the disease spreads through hands, through water, through objects, that anyone caring for a sick child must not approach the healthy ones until they've washed their hands with soap. Niobe didn't argue, not this time. She had seen his work for 2 weeks. She gave the order, and within an hour, the sick children were moved to the infirmary, all 12 of them. Second, clean water. Dan ordered all the water to be boiled, all of it, no exceptions, for drinking, for cooking, for washing dishes. He stationed Sana by the main fire with a single task, to make sure no pot of raw water made it to the chum. Sana stood there from morning till night, yelling at anyone who tried to scoop up raw water. Her loud voice finally came in handy. Third, rehydration. That was the most important thing. The children were dying of dysentery, not from the infection itself. They were dying from fluid loss. The body was losing water faster than it could replenish it. Organs were failing one by one. The kidneys first, then the heart. In the 21st century, dysentery was treated with I-5 drips of saline solution. Dan didn't have any I-5s, but he had a recipe. Oral rehydration salts. The WHO recipe. A liter of boiled water. 6 teaspoons of sugar. Half a teaspoon of salt. He didn't have sugar, but he had honey. Wild bees in the redwood forest. The porters collected honey once a season. There were supplies. And there was salt, coarse, gray, from hot springs. He mixed it. A liter of boiled, cooled water. Honey. Salt. He tasted it. Slightly sweet. Slightly salty. Not a perfect solution, but it worked. He began to give the children the mixture, in small sips, every 10 minutes. A tablespoon. No more. If a child vomited, he waited 5 minutes and gave it again. If a child refused to drink, he would wet a rag and squeeze a drop into their mouth. Leva helped. Quiet, careful Leva with her slender fingers. She gave it to 4 of them. Dan gave it to 8. Orsha came to the infirmary on the 2nd day of the epidemic. She stood in the doorway and watched. 12 children in skin and bones, pale, moaning. Dan on his knees among them, a clay cup in one hand and a wet cloth in the other. Leva beside him, quiet and methodical. No panic, no tambourines, no songs. Orsha asked how she could help. Dan didn't turn his head. He said he needed a decoction of redwood bark, a strong one. The bark contained tannins. He didn't know the exact chemical composition, but Diane's memory suggested that this bark was chewed for an upset stomach. Tannins are astringent. They slow down bowel movements. They don't cure, but they buy time. Orsha left and returned an hour later with a pot of reddish decoction, thick and bitter. Dan added it to his drink in small doses. Fourth, hygiene. All the sick children's waste was collected in separate pots and taken outside the camp. The skins beneath them were changed twice a day. Dirty skins were boiled. Hands were washed with soap before every contact. Dan made Leva wash her hands so often that the skin on her fingers began to crack. He made her an ointment from goat fat. On the evening of the 3rd day, the first child died. A girl, 2 years old, the youngest of the 12. Dan knew she would die. He had seen it in her eyes that very morning, sunken, dull. Dehydration had gone too far. She was the last to be admitted to the infirmary. By that point, her body could no longer retain fluids. He gave her water, every 5 minutes, drop by drop. But a 2-year-old's body isn't an adult's. Its reserves of strength are minimal. She died during the night, quietly, in Leva's arms. Leva was crying. Dan sat nearby. He wasn't crying. He'd lost his nerve during his 2nd year in the ambulance unit when, in a single night, he'd lost an elderly woman to a heart attack and a 16-year-old boy with a gunshot wound to the chest. He sat there and checked the pulses of the other 11. The girl's mother arrived in the morning. She didn't scream. She took the body away in silence. She looked at Dan. There was no accusation in her eyes. There was exhaustion. She said the spirits had taken their share. Dan didn't answer. He didn't believe in spirits. He believed in bacteria, and the bacteria had taken their share because he had been too slow. The 4th day, the 5th, 6th. He didn't leave the infirmary. Karin brought him food. He ate standing up, with one hand. With the other, he held the cup to the lips of the boy who refused to swallow. Orsha came twice a day. She brought a decoction. She changed the skins. She didn't say a word. On the 7th day, the fever began to subside in the first 3 children. On the 8th, they asked for food. On the 9th, Dan carried the last sick child out of the infirmary and handed him to his mother. 11 out of 12. He lost 1. He saved 11. In a world without antibiotics, without IVs, and without laboratories, with clean water, honey, salt, and stubbornness, the tribe didn't hold a celebration. There were no speeches. There were no bows. But something had changed. Dan could feel it in the way the women looked at him as he walked through the camp. Before, there had been fear in their eyes, superstitious, inhuman, silver eyes, a shaman man, a something. Now a different word had appeared in their eyes. He didn't know how it sounded in the Wei-Sharan language, but in English it sounded simple. Trust. Hagra. That very warrior woman with the severed ear who had argued with him about moving the pits. She stopped him by the fire on the evening of the 9th day. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said one word. She called him Torishan. Dan didn't know that expression. Diane's memory didn't know it either. He asked Karin later. Karin said it was an old word, very old. It means one who speaks with rot, one who hears the voice of disease and answers it. The last time a shaman was called that was 7 generations ago. Dan stood by the fire and looked at the 3 moons overhead, 1 green, 2 red. Somewhere in the camp a child was crying. Somewhere a drum was beating. Somewhere Orsha was singing an evening song. Somewhere Shayra was laughing. He was alone, far from home, far from everything he knew. But 11 children were alive, and tomorrow he had to get up, wash his hands, boil water, and carry on. An outbreak of dysentery struck 12 children in the camp. Dan imposed quarantine and rehydration with a solution of honey and salt. He lost 1 child, but saved 11. The tribe gave him the name Torishan, which means he who speaks with rot. Orsha began to help him silently, without argument or resistance. In the 3rd week, Dan left the camp for the first time. He wasn't alone. Karin walked ahead with a spear on her shoulder. 2 scouts named Tala and Vierne walked on either side. Dan walked between them and felt like a package being carried by very careful couriers. He needed herbs, not the ones that grew near the camp, others. Diane's memory held fragments, names, smells, places. The white root that grew near the hot springs, the blue moss on the rocks above the tree line, the yellow resin of the red-trunked trees that Orsha gathered once a year and stored like gold. Dan didn't know the chemical composition of any of these plants, but he knew the principles. Tannins astringent, resins disinfect, essential oils relieve pain, alkaloids can be both poison and medicine. He needed to gather them, test them, systematize them, create a pharmacy. Not a shaman's bag of dried bundles, but a real pharmacy with labels and dosages. The forest surrounding the highlands was another world. The red-trunked trees rose 30 meters. Their bark was dark crimson and warm to the touch. Dan pressed his palm against the trunk and felt the tree hum, quietly, barely perceptibly. It wasn't a sound. It was something else. His shamanic gift, faint, background, like static at the edge of the dial. He felt life in the tree, sap flowing through the trunk, roots reaching deep into the hot earth, and something else, a presence, spirits. Dan didn't see them, didn't hear voices, didn't receive visions, but he knew they were nearby. Like knowing someone is standing behind you in a dark room. Karen noticed he had frozen by the tree. She asked what was wrong. Dan said he was listening. Karen asked what he was hearing. Dan said nothing useful yet. Karen shrugged and walked on. They gathered for 3 hours. Dan peeled off the bark, dug up the roots, collected moss, resin, leaves, berries. He put everything separately into leather pouches that Leva had sewn for him. He marked each pouch with a notch. 1 notch, 2, 3, his own system, because he had no paper, and no ink, and no alphabet that his assistants would understand either. He memorized it. Root from a hot spring, 1 notch, for heat. Blue moss, 2 notches, for wounds. Yellow resin, 3 notches, for inflammation. When they returned to camp, Dan spent the whole evening by the fire, boiling, pounding, mixing, sniffing, tasting with the tip of his tongue. Some things were bitter, some burned. One berry numbed his lips for 10 minutes, and he mentally marked it as a local anesthetic. Karen sat nearby, sharpening a knife. She no longer complained about being assigned to him. She still considered him weak and strange. But after the dysentery, something between them had changed. She had seen him work for 9 days without sleep. She had seen him lose a child and not break. For a warrior who had valued only strength and resilience her entire life, this was understandable. Not respect yet, but recognition. The next day, Dan began doing what no shaman in the history of Isanur had ever done. He began keeping records. Not on paper, on thin birch bark sheets. The bark of a white tree that grew by the stream, thin, smooth. He wrote with a sharpened bone dipped in the juice of black berries. The ink was pale but legible. He recorded everything, every patient, age, symptoms, what he prescribed, how much, the result, recovered, did not recover, died. These were medical records, the first medical records in the world of Isanur. No one understood why. Orsha stood behind him and looked at the symbols on the birch bark. She asked what they were. Dan said it was the language of the spirits, that the spirits demand precision, that he records every illness and every treatment so the spirits can see he's attentive. Orsha snorted. She said that in 40 years, the spirits hadn't demanded any records from her. Dan said maybe that's why the spirits had stopped talking to her. He immediately regretted what he'd said. Orsha froze. Her face went stiff. She turned and walked away. Karen whistled. She said that Dan had just offended the only person in the camp who brews poppy tea. Dan rubbed the bridge of his nose. 4 years in the ambulance service had taught him how to talk to people during the worst moments of their lives, but it hadn't taught him when to keep quiet. He found Orsha that evening. She was sitting alone by her campfire, an old woman with hands that had witnessed hundreds of births and dozens of deaths. Dan sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, so that their shoulders were almost touching. He was silent for a long time. Then he said he was wrong, that the spirits speak to everyone differently. With her, through her hands and voice. With him, through his notes. That he wanted to learn from her. That he didn't know half the herbs she knew. And that without her, 11 children would be dead because it was she who brought the red bark decoction that gave him time. Orsha was silent. Then she asked if he really wanted to learn, or if he was just saying nice things so she would brew potions for him. Dan said it was true. He said, "Show me your herbs. I want to know every one." Orsha looked at him. For a long time. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. The old women of this world didn't cry. She stood up and told him to come to her yurt at dawn tomorrow. He came. And from that day on, every morning began with an hour at Orsha's. She would take out her little bags, dozens of little bags, hundreds, 40 years of knowledge in leather pouches. She showed them and named them. Moontooth root, for labor pains. 3 pinches in a pot, no more. 4 pinches, and the woman will fall asleep and never wake up. Red shadow leaf, for burns. Grind it up and apply. Don't boil it. Boiling makes it lose its potency. Starflower pollen. To stop bleeding. Press it against the wound. Hold it there. Don't remove it until it sticks. Dan wrote everything down, on birch bark, in his own symbols, every name, every dosage, every warning. He compared it with what he knew. Moontooth root likely worked like oxytocin. It stimulated the uterus. An overdose caused convulsions. Red shadowleaf was likely an antiseptic with an analgesic effect. Starflower pollen was a local hemostatic, something like a cellulose hemostatic. He couldn't verify it. There was no lab, no microscope. But he could compare his observations and record the results and build a database, slowly, one entry at a time. Orsha watched him work. Her face had an expression Dan had seen on the old doctors' faces at Harborview when a resident asked a good question. A mixture of surprise and something resembling hope. She never again said that a man couldn't be at the drum. She said something else. She said, "Remember. Remember because I'm old and I'll die soon, and everything in my head will die with me." Dan remembered. By the end of the first month, he had 43 entries on herbs, 16 entries on patients, a soap recipe, a rehydration solution recipe, a camp layout diagram with notes, a blueprint for the new infirmary, the first medical archive in the history of Isanur. He kept the birch bark in a leather pouch under his cot. Karen once asked what would happen if that pouch burned. Dan said that then he would start over. Karen said he was crazy. Dan said it was professional. Karen didn't understand the word, but smiled. On the 30th day since waking up, Dan stood before the small council. Niobe sat in the center, Hagra to the right, Orsha to the left. The 3 senior warriors stood behind them. Niobe said the moon had passed, that the council had seen his work, that he was staying, not just until the end of winter, forever. Dan bowed, as an equal, just like the first time. Only now, no one placed a hand on the hilt of a knife. Dan gathered medicinal herbs in the forest and began creating a medicine cabinet and a medical archive on birch bark tablets. He made peace with Orsha and began learning about herbs from her every morning. Orsha began to pass on her knowledge to him. After 30 days, the council recognized him as the shaman of Ve Sharan forever. Winter came in the 6th week. Not slowly, not gradually. It descended upon the highlands in a single night. Dan woke up from the cold that had seeped through 3 layers of skins. He stepped out of the hut and saw that the world had turned white. The snow was knee-deep. The wind carried icy sleet. The hot rivers down in the valley steamed so that it seemed as if the earth were breathing. The temperature had dropped so sharply that 2 goats in the pen had died of heart failure overnight. Dan stood in the doorway and took stock. Food supplies in the storeroom, smoked and dried meat. He had helped organize the harvest over the past 3 weeks. Dried fish, roots, berries mashed with honey, salt, lots of salt. He had insisted they stockpile 3 times as much as usual. Salt is a preservative. Salt is life. Niobe didn't understand why they needed so much, but she didn't argue. Now, standing knee-deep in the snow, Dan was doing the math. 350 people. Winter lasts 4 months. You need more calories in the cold. The supplies would last 3 months if they were frugal, 3.5 if they were very frugal, 4 if someone went hungry. It wasn't enough. He went over to Niobe. She was standing by the main fire, listening to the scouts' reports. The mountain passes were closed. The southern trail was blocked. The eastern trail was still passable, but it would close in a week, too. A herd of wild antelopes had headed south earlier than usual. The hunters had returned with 3 carcasses from their last outing. Not enough. Dan waited until the scouts had left. Then he told Niobe that their supplies wouldn't last. Niobe nodded. She knew. She said that the Ve Sharan had survived winters worse than this, that they would hunt, that they would fish in the hot rivers beneath the ice, that they would survive. Dan said they would survive, but not everyone. That if they didn't change their approach to food storage, By the third month of winter, the children would start getting sick from malnutrition. And a sick child in the cold is a dead child. Niobe looked at him. She asked what he suggested. Dan suggested 3 things. First, fermentation. He had seen in Diane's memory that the women of the tribe made a sour drink from berries. Fermentation, the same principle as sauerkraut or kimchi or pickles. Fermented food keeps longer. It contains more nutrients. And most importantly, it contains vitamins that aren't found in dried meat. He couldn't say the word vitamin. He said that fermented food contains the earth's power, which doesn't die during storage. Niobe didn't understand but allowed him to try. Second, the glacier. Snow all around, temperatures below 0, ideal conditions. He suggested digging a pit in the frozen ground behind the camp and storing the meat there. Not in the yurts where it's warm from the fires, not out in the open where animals could get to it. In the ice cave, where the temperature is constant and low. The porters dug the pit in 2 days, a deep one. They lined the walls with stones. They covered it with animal skins and filled it with snow. The meat inside kept for much longer. Third, rations. He suggested distributing food according to rations. Not everyone takes as much as they want, but everyone gets what they need. The female warriors who go out hunting and patrol get more. Children received milk from the goats and fermented berries. Porters and artisans received the average ration. This was the hardest part. The tribe had never rationed food. Food was shared. Whoever was stronger ate first. Whoever was weaker waited. The male porters ate last, always. Dan couldn't change that in a single day. He didn't try. He took a different approach. He suggested to Niobe that she appoint him to be in charge of food distribution during the winter, like a shaman, like the voice of the spirits. The spirits tell everyone how much to eat. Niobe thought about it for a long time. Then she agreed. Dan began distributing food in the mornings, by himself, with Leva and Sana, to every chum, to every family. He didn't cut the warriors' portions. He didn't give the men more than before. But he made sure the children got milk every day, that pregnant women got honey and fat, that the elderly received hot broth with salt, and that no one starved to the point where the body begins to eat itself. Hagra was unhappy. She said at the council that the shaman was meddling in matters not his own, that food was the warrior's business, not a man with a drum. Niobe asked Hagra how many people had died of starvation last winter. Hagra fell silent. 7. Niobe said that this winter, 0 would die. Hagra looked at Dan. He calmly held her gaze. Hagra left, not agreeing, but no longer objecting either. Winter was pressing down. Every day Dan woke up in the dark. In winter, the sun rose late and set early over the highlands. 6 hours of daylight. The rest was darkness and cold. He made his rounds through the camp every morning, checked on the sick. He changed bandages. He examined the children. He listened to their lungs, pressing his ear to their chests. Wheezing meant pneumonia. Pneumonia in winter in this world meant death if not caught early. He caught 2 cases. He carried both children to the infirmary. Warmth, warm drinks, inhalations over a pot of hot water and eucalyptus leaves, which Orsha called blue breath. The steam opened up the bronchial tubes. The hot water loosened the phlegm. Both children recovered. Orsha stood nearby while he administered the inhalations. She had never seen this method before. She asked how he knew about it. Dan said the spirits had shown him in a dream. Orsha said the spirits that appeared to him were very practical. Dan looked at her. She was almost smiling. It was the first smile he had ever seen on the old herbalist's face. He smiled back. By midwinter, Dan introduced another innovation. Evening sessions by the campfire. He called it the campfire school. Every evening after dinner, he would sit by the main fire and tell stories. Not shamanic legends, not stories of spirits. Simple things. Why you should wash your hands. How to tell if water is dirty. How to tell a dangerous wound from a harmless one. The 5 signs of inflammation. How to make a splint out of a stick and cloth. How to Stop Bleeding by Applying Pressure. At first, only Leva and Sana came. Then a few more young girls joined in. Then Cotton came. She sat in the back row and pretended to be sharpening a knife, but she was listening, Dan could tell. Then the porters arrived, 2 of them, then 5, men, whom no one had ever taught anything except how to lift heavy things and keep quiet. They crouched in the circle of light and listened so intently that it hurt Dan's chest. One of them was named Rohan, broad-shouldered, silent, with hands that could bend an iron rod. He approached Dan after the 3rd lesson and asked if he could learn how to bandage. Dan said he could. Rohan started coming every evening. Niobe found out about the School of the Fire in the 2nd week. She came. She looked around. She sat down. She listened. She left. She didn't say a word. But the next day she ordered a large stone by the main fire to be set aside for the lessons, so that everyone could see and everyone could hear. Dan sat on that rock every evening. He spoke. He demonstrated. He answered questions. And every evening, when everyone had left, he remained alone and stared into the fire. And he thought about how it was winter in Seattle right now, too, and that his mother had probably lit a candle in church, and that he couldn't tell her he was alive, because he didn't know if he was actually alive. A harsh winter began, and Dan organized a system for storing food through fermentation, an ice house, and rationed food distribution. He established the Campfire School, where he taught the basics of medicine to everyone, including the men porters. Orsha began to cooperate openly with him. A porter named Rohan became his first male student. In the 4th month of winter, what Dan had both hoped for and feared happened. The burial. The old hunter Togar had died of gangrene even before Dan's arrival. A stag had shattered his leg during a hunt. Orsha treated him as best she could. It didn't help. The gangrene spread above the knee, and Togar passed away within 2 weeks. The body lay in an icy pit at the edge of the camp for 3 months, because in winter you can't bury anyone. The ground is frozen. It's impossible to dig. The way Sharan buried their dead with fire, a funeral pyre. But the pyre for a warrior was lit on the day of the long night, the longest night of winter, the middle of the season. Tradition required that the widow stand by the fire from sunset to sunrise, alone, without help, without warmth except for the heat from the flames devouring her husband's body. It was a trial, a test of loyalty. Mira was Togar's widow, a short woman in her 40s, quiet, unassuming, not a warrior, a weaver. She wove the finest hides in the tribe. Her hands were golden, but her feet were in trouble. Dan noticed it a week before the long night. Mira came to the infirmary complaining of back pain. He examined her. Her back was fine. But when he saw her feet, he froze. The toes on both feet were white, not pink, white. 2nd-degree frostbite. She was wearing thin leather wraps that offered no protection from the cold. He asked how long it had been like that. She said 3 days, that her toes were numb and she couldn't feel them. Dan gently touched her toes. Cold, hard, waxy. A few more days and necrosis would set in, and if she stood by the fire in the snow all night, by morning the frostbite would progress to 3rd degree, and then amputation. No other option. He could go to Niobe and ask her to abolish the tradition. But he knew he couldn't. Traditions in this world were not wishes, but laws. To violate the funeral rite meant to insult the spirits of the dead. It meant condemning his soul to eternal wandering. Mira would rather lose both her legs than allow such a thing to happen to her husband's soul. Dan thought about it all evening. He sat by the fire and stared into the fire. Karin sat beside him, cleaning the arrowheads. She asked what was wrong. He said that Mira would lose her legs after the long night. Karin shrugged. She said that Mira knew, that this was the price, that it had always been this way. Dan said it shouldn't be this way. Karin looked at him. She asked what he was going to do. Dan replied that he didn't know yet. But in the morning, he didn't go to Niobe. He went to Orsha. He sat down across from her and said he wanted to learn the Way Sharan funeral song. Orsha looked up. Her eyes grew wide. She asked why he needed a funeral song. Dan said he was the tribe's shaman, that a funeral was a ritual, and that a shaman had to know the rituals. Orsha was silent for a long time. Then she said that no man had ever sung the Vaisharan funeral song in all of history, that it was a song of women, for women, about women. Dan said he understood that, and that he wasn't asking for the right to sing this song at every funeral, just at one, this one. Orsha asked why. Dan told her about Mira, about frostbite, about what would happen if she stood alone all night in the cold. Orsha listened. She had known Mira for 30 years. She knew Togara. She had held their only child, who died in infancy. She closed her eyes, then opened them, and began to sing, softly, low. No words at first, just a melody, simple, like a breath. 3 notes up, 2 down, repeat. Then words. Dan didn't understand every word. The Vaisharan language was his language through Diane's memory, but the song dialect differed from the spoken one. He understood the essence. The song was about the river, about how the river carries a body to the sea, about how fire meets water, about how smoke rises to the stars and becomes light, about how the living let go of the dead. He listened. He memorized it. He repeated after Orsha, line by line. His voice was different, male, lower, rougher. The song sounded different when he sang it. Not worse, not better, different. Orsha listened and didn't interrupt. He learned the song over 3 days, 2 hours a day. Orsha corrected every note, every syllable. She was a ruthless teacher. But when, on the 3rd day, he sang it from beginning to end without a mistake, she nodded. Once. It was approval. The long night had come. It had been snowing since morning. By evening, so much had fallen that the trails were buried up to the waist. A funeral pyre had been built in the square at the center of the camp. Togar's body lay on top, wrapped in white hides, with his weapons, with his hunter's belt. The whole tribe gathered around, in silence. There were no torches, only the light of the fire. Mira stepped forward, in white, barefoot, on the snow. Her face was calm. She knew what was coming, knew the price, was ready. Nioba lit the fire. The flames rose, huge, hot. Sparks flew into the black sky. Mira stood, alone, by the fire, in the snow. Dan stood in the crowd, in the full shaman's regalia they had given him a month ago. A white fur cloak, a necklace of bones and stones. His silver eyes glowed in the light of the fire. He took a step forward. The crowd froze. Niobe turned her head. Orsha stood at the edge of the square and watched him. Not with surprise. She knew. She had been waiting. Dan crossed the square and stood next to Mira, not opposite her, not in her place, next to her, shoulder to shoulder. And he began to sing. The silence was such that he could hear the fire crackling. He could hear the snowflakes falling. His voice rose into the cold air, low, steady. The funeral song of Vaisharan, from a man's lips for the first time in the tribe's history. Mira shuddered. She turned her head. She looked at him. There was something in her eyes that Dan couldn't put into words. Surprise, gratitude, pain, relief. She turned back to the fire, and he sang, all night long, next to her, in the snow, in the cold. His voice grew hoarse by midnight. By morning he was barely whispering, but he didn't stop. Mira stood beside him. He stood beside her. They stood together. When the fire had burned down to embers, and the first light appeared in the east, Mira staggered. Dan caught her. She was light, cold, but alive. He carried her to the infirmary. He unwound the bandages from her feet. Her toes were red from the cold, but not white, not dead. He warmed them slowly, with warm water, gradually, not hot. Hot water on frostbite is a burn on top of frostbite. Warm, slowly. Sensation was returning. Mira was crying, quietly, not from pain. She said that Togar had not gone to the stars alone, that he had heard a man's song, and that his soul was smiling. Dan said nothing. He just held her feet in the warm water and waited. The tribe stood in complete silence as he carried Mira across the square. 300 people, not a sound. Then Niobe stepped toward him. She placed her hand on his shoulder, not as a chieftain to a shaman, like one person to another. Her hand was heavy and warm. She said nothing. She didn't know how to say what she felt, but her hand on his shoulder spoke for her. No one in the tribe ever again asked if he had the right to be there. At the long night festival, Dan learned a funeral song from Orshi and stood beside the widow Mira at the funeral pyre. He sang all night, for the first time in the tribe's history. A man at the funeral pyre. He saved Mira's feet from frostbite and finally earned his place in Wei Sharan. Spring did not come. It burst forth like water through a dam. One day snow, the next day streams. A week later, the ground is black and wet, and the steam from the hot rivers is so thick that you can't see 10 steps ahead. Dan stood at the edge of the camp and breathed. The air smelled of earth and something sweet. The red-trunked trees had put out their first buds, scarlet, bright, like drops of blood on white branches. Winter was over. 353 people had entered it. 353 had come out. Not a single death from starvation. Not a single death from illness. For the first time in 5 years. Niobe stood beside him, silently. They stood like that sometimes, without speaking, just side by side. She would come to him in the evenings after the council. She would sit by his fire. She would be silent. Sometimes she talked about the tribe's affairs, about how the scouts had seen traces of foreign hunters near the southern border, about how the goats had started giving milk after the winter break, about how Shira had learned to throw a spear and hit the target from 10 paces away. Little things. Dan listened. He understood that for Niobe, this wasn't just a conversation. It was the only respite she allowed herself all day. For 20 years, she had been in command. For 20 years, she had made decisions on which lives depended. And not once in those 20 years had she had a person with whom she could simply sit by the fire and be silent. Dan didn't rush her. He was a medic. He knew that some wounds heal only if left alone. But spring brought more than just warmth. It brought news. Tala was the first to arrive, a scout. She returned from patrol wet and angry and said she'd seen smoke to the south. A lot of smoke. Not hunters' fires, campfires. A large camp. Niobe convened the small council. Smoke to the south could mean one of two things. Either a nomadic tribe was heading north through the territory of the Wei Sharan, or someone had set up camp at the southern border. Hagra said it was the Kartog, a neighboring tribe, 400 warriors, an old enemy. Their territory bordered the southern pastures of the Wei Sharan, and every spring skirmishes broke out over fresh grass. Niobe sent Tala and 4 scouts to investigate. They returned 3 days later. It was the Kartog, but not a raid. The scouts saw women and children, the elderly, the sick. The Kartog were heading north as a whole tribe. Something had happened to them in the south. Something bad. Niobe ordered the patrols doubled. Karen personally led a group of 8 spearwomen to the southern ridge. Dan asked to go with them. Niobe said no. Karen said no. Orsha said he was crazy. Dan said that if there were wounded or sick people there, he was needed there and not here. Niobe looked at him for a long time. Then she said, okay. But if he died, she would personally raise his spirit from the dead to kill again. They walked for half a day. Through the wet forest, through ravines full of meltwater. Dan was exhausted after 2 hours. His body was that of an 18-year-old, and he had grown stronger over the winter, but he was still a man among female warriors. Karen walked ahead with a spear and wasn't even out of breath. She turned around every 10 minutes and looked at Dan with an expression that suggested she was considering simply hoisting him over her shoulder and carrying him. On the southern ridge, they saw the Kartog camp. Dark leather tents, dozens of them, campfires, people, Lots of people. And among them, the wounded. Dan could see it even from a distance. Bandages, limping figures, stretchers. Karin said quietly that this wasn't a migration, it was a flight. They retreated back to the ridge, and Karin sent 2 scouts to Niobe. A reply came a day later. Niobe ordered them to watch, but not to make contact. The Kartogs were enemies, 3 generations of conflict, blood on both sides. But Dan looked down at the camp and saw no enemies. He saw the wounded, the sick, children by the campfires, women with empty eyes. He had seen this before. In the refugee camps in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. The same faces, the same exhaustion, the same scent of despair. On the 3rd day of observation, a Kartog scout climbed up to the ridge, alone, unarmed, with her hands raised, young, tall, dark-skinned, with long braids and a tattooed rune on her throat. She walked slowly and looked straight at them. Karin raised her spear. The scout stopped 20 paces away and said she wanted to speak. Karin asked, "What about?" The scout said their chieftain was asking for help, that people with iron chains had come from the south, many of them, that the Kartog had fought for 3 days. They had won, but they had lost 40 warriors, and another 60 were wounded. And they had no shaman. Their shaman had died 2 years ago, and the wounds were festering, and the children were sick. And they had heard that Wei Sharan had a shaman, a man with silver eyes, who heals. Karin looked at Dan. Dan looked at the scout. He asked her name. She said T. He asked how many were wounded. She said 62. He asked how many had infections. She said she didn't know. A lot. He asked how many children were sick. She said 14. Dan closed his eyes. 62 wounded, 14 sick children. No shaman, no medicine, no clean bandages, no boiled water. It was a death camp. In a week, mass sepsis would set in and the children would drop from dehydration. He opened his eyes and looked at Karin. Karin shook her head. She said no. Said that the Kartogs were enemies, that 3 generations of blood, that it was forbidden. Dan said he had no enemies. He had patience. Karin said Niobe wouldn't allow it. Dan said then he'd go without permission. Karin grabbed his shoulder. Her fingers were like iron pincers. She said he wasn't going anywhere. That she was his bodyguard and she decided where he went. Dan looked at her hand, then at her. He said quietly, "Children are dying there, Karin. Children." Karin held him by the shoulder. Her jaw was clenched. She looked at him, then at the camp below. Then she let go, and said that he really was crazy, but if he was going, she was going with him. They went down together. Dan, Karin, and Thea from Kartog, who led them through her camp to the wounded tent. The smell hit him first. Pus, blood, sweat, fear. Dan knew that smell. It smelled just like the emergency room on a Friday night at Harborview, only 100 times worse. The tent for the wounded in the Kartog camp was large, 30 paces long, 15 wide. Dark leather stretched over poles. Inside lay women, warriors. Some were moaning, some were silent. Some were in that state where they no longer moan. Dan stopped at the entrance and looked around. Karin stood behind him with a spear. Thea stood beside him and looked at him with an expression he'd seen on the faces of relatives in the emergency room. Hope mixed with horror. He began with triage, sorting. The first thing paramedics are taught. Don't treat everyone indiscriminately. Assess first. Sort. Prioritize. He walked along the rows, 62 wounded. He examined each one, quickly, 30 seconds per person. Pulse, temperature, skin color, condition of wounds, odor. He divided them into 3 groups. First, severe. Those who need immediate help or they will die in the coming days. Deep, infected wounds, onset of sepsis, broken bones with open fractures. 14 people. Second, moderate. Wounds are serious but not life-threatening if treated correctly. Cuts, closed fractures, bruises, burns. 31 people. Third, minor. Scratches, abrasions, minor cuts, bruises, 17 people. He set the minor cases aside. The moderate ones could be treated gradually. The severe ones came first. He turned to Thea and told her what he needed. Boiling water, lots of it. Clean cloth, all of it. A knife, a sharp one. A needle, thread, honey, salt, fermented juice if there was any. Thea ran off. Karen stood at the entrance and let no one in except those Dan asked for. The Kartog warriors looked at her with grim respect. The red-haired spearwoman, Wei Sharan, with 2 knives on her belt and a look that said she'd slit the throat of anyone who took a step without asking. Dan started with the first serious case. A warrior in her 30s. A sword wound on her left thigh, deep, down to the bone. The edges were black, the smell of rot. The infection had been going on for 5 days already. Red streaks from the wound up her body toward her groin. Lymphangitis. 2 more days and sepsis. 3 more and death. He washed the wound with boiled water. The woman growled through clenched teeth but didn't scream. A warrior. He cut out the dead tissue, every black piece, down to the living flesh, down to the blood. He rinsed it again, poured fermented juice over it. He applied honey. Honey was an antiseptic. He knew this from his research. The osmotic effect drew moisture out of the bacteria. Hydrogen peroxide was released upon contact with the wound. Not ideal, but it worked. Bandaged it with clean cloth. Next, an open fracture of the forearm. The bone was sticking through the skin, swelling, heat, pus. He washed it out, set the bone. The woman lost consciousness from the pain, and that was for the best. He applied a splint made of 2 straight sticks and cloth, bandaged it. Next, next, next. 14 serious cases. He worked 6 hours without a break. Thea brought water and cloth. She ran around the camp. She found honey. She found juice. She even found clean hides for bedding. Dan worked with hands that didn't tremble. 4 years in an ambulance. 2 years of volunteering. Thousands of patients. His body was weak in this world, but his hands knew what to do. By evening, he had treated all 14 of the critically injured. 3 were on the brink. He didn't know if they would survive. 11 had a chance. Then he moved on to the moderately injured. Another 4 hours. Clean. Bandage. Apply a splint. Give care instructions. Thea translated his words for those who didn't understand the northern dialect. She memorized everything, every instruction, every movement. She watched his hands the way Orsha had watched when he first showed her how to apply a clean bandage. With hunger, with a thirst for knowledge. That night he sat by the fire at Carr's camp. Tog. Karen sat nearby. She wasn't sleeping. She kept her eyes fixed on the female warriors walking around, her hand on the hilt of her knife. Dan was too tired to be afraid. He ate what Thea had brought, meat, flatbreads, hot broth. The food was different. The flavor was sharper. Spices. The Kartogs cooked differently than the Wei Sharans. A woman approached the fire, tall, broad-shouldered, with one eye. The other was covered by a bandage. Her arm was in a sling. It was Ranga, the Kartog's military leader. Not the chief leader, a warrior, the one who led the female warriors into battle. She stood and looked down at Dan. Then she sat down across from him. Her one eye was dark and sharp. She said he was small for a shaman. Dan said that spirits don't measure height. Ranga smirked. She said he had healed 14 of her best fighters in a single day, that their own herbalist couldn't do it in a week. Dan said their herbalist had done her best, that without the knowledge he possessed, she couldn't have done more. Ranga asked where he got this knowledge. Dan said, from the spirits. Ranga said she didn't believe in spirits. Dan said he didn't care what she believed in. What mattered to him was that her warriors were alive. Ranga looked at him for a long time. Then she said that Kartog owed him a debt. Dan said he didn't need a debt. He needed peace. Ranga asked what kind of peace. Dan said peace between the Kartog and the Wei Sharan. He said the slave traders would come again, that they had come for the Kartog because the Kartog were alone, that if the two tribes stood together, the slave traders would think twice. Ranga was silent. She stared into the fire. Then she said that 3 generations of blood cannot be washed away in a single night. Dan said he wasn't asking to wash away the blood. He was asking not to spill any new blood. Ranga stood up and left, without answering. Karen said quietly that he was asking for trouble, that he was meddling in politics, that this was a matter for the chieftains, not the shamans. Dan said that when people die, it's everyone's business. He spent 3 days at the Kartag camp. Every day he examined the wounded, changed bandages, cleaned wounds. One of the 3 in critical condition died on the 2nd day. The sepsis had gone too far. The other 2 began to recover. He taught Thea the basics: hand washing, boiling instruments, clean bandages, rehydration for sick children. Thea memorized everything. She followed him like a shadow. She memorized it all because she had no birch bark to write on. She repeated every movement. When he left the Camp I Kartag on the 4th day, Thea stood at the edge of the camp and watched him go. She said she would remember. Dan said he would return. Thea said she would too. Karan walked beside him along the trail back to Shaman. She was silent for half the journey. Then she said there was one thing he hadn't cured. Dan asked what. Karan raised her arm and showed him a long cut on her forearm, fresh, from a knife. She said that one of the Kartag warriors had decided to test the redhead, and that she'd had to explain something about the spears of Shaman. Dan stopped. He looked at the cut. Shallow, clean. He rinsed it with water from his flask, bandaged it with a strip of cloth. Karan watched his hands, slender, deft, confident. She said he had good hands. Dan looked up. Karan wasn't looking at his hands. She was looking at him. Then she turned away and walked on, quickly, without looking back. Dan stood on the trail for a second. Then he followed her. When they returned to Shaman, Niobe was waiting for them by the main fire. Her face was stony. She didn't shout. She spoke quietly, and that made it even scarier. She said he had left without permission, that he had put himself in danger, that he could have died and the tribe would have lost its only shaman. Dan stood and listened. He didn't make excuses. When Niobe finished, he said one thing, that 61 people were alive because he had gone. Niobe was silent. Then she told him never to leave without her permission again. Dan bowed. Niobe turned and walked away. Karen stood nearby and said quietly that he'd gotten off easy. For something like that, Niobe could have sent him to clean the pens for a month. Dan said he'd cleaned pens in the Philippines and had survived just fine. Karen asked what the Philippines were. Dan said they were a distant land across the sea. Karen said there was no such thing as the sea. Dan didn't argue. Dan spent 3 days at the Kartag camp and treated 61 wounded people. He proposed peace between the tribes to the military leader Ranga. He taught T the basics of medicine. On the way back, Karen showed personal interest in him for the first time. Niobe scolded him for leaving without permission, but accepted the result. Summer brought heat and visitors. The first to arrive were traders from the east, a small caravan, 5 women, 2 male porters, 3 pack goats laden with bundles. They were carrying salt, bronze, red clay for pottery, and news. The news was bad. The female merchants reported that a new caravan of slave traders had appeared on the coast. A large one, 30 chains, dogs, crossbows. They were led by a man called Orkhan Iron Collar. The name was known throughout the highlands. Orkhan didn't burn villages. He didn't kill without need. He was worse. He bought. He found elders who had nothing to feed their tribe. He found female chieftains in debt. He offered bronze and grain. And he took people, young women, strong men, children. He sold them on the coast. From there, they were taken away by ship to lands no one knew anything about. The merchants said that Orkhan had heard of a male shaman, that for a living shaman with silver eyes, he would pay as much bronze as the shaman himself weighed. Niobe listened to this with a stony face. Then she sent the traders off to eat and turned to Dan. She said that he was now the most valuable prize in the highlands. Dan said he was flattered. Niobe did not smile. She gathered the great council, all the senior warriors, Hagra, Karen, Tala, Virn, 12 more, and Dan. For the first time, a man sat on the great council of the Wei-Sharan. No one objected. Niobe unfolded a map, not a paper one, a map carved into a piece of tanned leather. Mountains, rivers, trails. The Wei-Sharan camp in the center. The territory of Kar-Tog to the south. Passes to the east and west. The coast far to the north. She asked Dan what he thought. Dan looked at the map. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a tactician. He knew nothing about medieval sieges. But he knew a thing or two about logistics. 4 years in the ambulance service had taught him to think about routes and time. 2 years in the Philippines had taught him to think about resources. He said that Orhun had 30 mercenaries. Wei-Sharan had 300 female warriors, a 10-to-1 numerical advantage. But Orhun isn't a fool. He won't charge head-on. He'll come when they least expect it, at night, in the snow, when half the tribe is asleep. And he won't storm the entire camp. He'll go for one target, the shaman's hut, him. Hagra said they'd post guards. Dan said guards are good, but not enough. That Orhun is a merchant. He's used to calculating. He won't come until he's convinced the reward outweighs the risk. So we have to make the risk unbearable. He suggested 3 things. First, pitfalls on the approaches to the camp, deep ones, with sharpened stakes at the bottom, camouflaged with branches and snow. He'd seen them in the Philippines pin us. Hunters in Mindanao used them against wild boars. They work just as well against people. Second, signal fires. 4 points around the camp, a scout on duty at each one. At the first sign of strangers, she lights a fire. The whole camp would be on its feet in a minute. Third, shelters for children and the non-combatants. A stone cave 300 paces west of the camp. He had seen it during one of his patrols. Large enough, hidden enough. The children and the elderly can be taken there in the event of an attack. And he'll set up a field hospital there as well. Bandages, sterilized needles, a supply of clean water, honey, salt. Everything is prepared in advance. Karin listened and nodded. Hagra listened and didn't nod, but she didn't object. Niobe listened and remained silent. Then she said the plan was good, but not complete, because 30 mercenaries with crossbows are a serious force, and even with trap pits and signal fires, Wei-Sharan will suffer losses. And then Dan said what he'd been thinking for 2 months. He said they needed an alliance with Kar-Tog. Silence. Hagra slammed her fist into the ground. She said it was impossible. That 3 generations, that blood, that honor. Dan said that honor doesn't feed the dead, and that the Kar-Tog had already fought the slave traders and knew how they waged war, and that Ranga, the military leader of the Kar-Tog, had told him she owed him a debt. Niobe asked when Ranga had said that. Dan said at the camp, when he was treating the wounded. Niobe looked at him. There was something new in her gaze. She saw him as a shaman, as a healer, as a teacher. But now she saw something else. A man who thinks 3 steps ahead, who heals not only bodies but also the relationships between tribes. She said she would send a messenger to Kar-Tog. Hagra stood up and left the council, silently. Niobe did not stop her. Tala volunteered to be the messenger. She left the next morning. She returned 5 days later. She was accompanied by Thea, the messenger of Kar-Tog, officially, with authority from Rangi and from the chiefess of Kar-Tog, the old Maera. Thea brought the answer. The Kar-Togs agree to negotiations, not an alliance, negotiations. Maera wants to meet with Niobe on neutral ground, in 10 days, at the pass between the territories. Niobe agreed. Dan asked permission to go with her. Niobe said no. Then she thought about it. Then she said yes, because Ranga knew him, and because his presence was an argument, a living argument. Here is the shaman who healed your people. Here is the reason why we should be together. The meeting took place 10 days later, at the pass. A cold wind, gray rocks. Two groups of women stood facing each other, Niobe with 10 warriors, Myra with 10. Myra was old, over 70 winters, bent over, with white hair. But her eyes were alive, sharp, intelligent. She saw Dan and looked long and hard into his silver eyes. Then she said she'd heard about him, that her warriors spoke of a man who healed better than any shaman, that Taya spoke of him every evening by the fire, that Ranga spoke of him too, and that Ranga had never spoken of anyone like that before. The negotiations lasted 2 days. Niobe and Mera argued over borders, over pastures, over old grievances. Dan didn't interfere. He sat nearby and remained silent. But when the conversation reached an impasse over the southern pastures, Dan asked to speak. Niobe nodded. He said the southern pastures could be divided, not in half, by season. The Waisharan graze their goats in the spring and summer, the Kartog in the fall and winter. The land rests between seasons. The goats don't graze the grass down to the roots. Both tribes win. Mera listened. Then she said that the boy with silver eyes was smarter than he looked. Niobe said he wasn't a boy. He was a Waisharan shaman, and his voice is the voice of the tribe. Mera looked at Niobe, then at Dan. Then she nodded. The agreement was sealed on the 3rd day. Peace. Not eternal. A trial one. For 2 years. Division of pastures. Mutual aid in the event of an attack by slave traders. And one condition from Mera. She wants the shaman with silver eyes to come to Kartog and examine her youngest granddaughter, whose right arm won't straighten after a birth injury. Dan agreed. News arrived about the slave trader Orhun Iron Collar, who was hunting for Dan. Dan proposed a plan to defend the camp and insisted on an alliance with Kartog. Niobe and Mera signed a 2-year peace treaty with the division of pastures and mutual military assistance. Dan agreed to examine Mera's granddaughter. Thea remained in Waisharan, officially as the Kartog ambassador, a constant link between the two tribes. She lived in a separate yurt on the edge of the camp and came to the infirmary every day. She helped. She learned. She watched Dan's hands as he bandaged, washed, and stitched. She memorized. Karen watched her with a wariness that had nothing to do with intertribal hostility. Dan didn't notice. He was busy. 2 weeks after the treaty was signed, another guest arrived in Waisharan, a young woman, short, thin, in a floor-length gray cloak, long black hair, a face as calm as water on a windless day. She came alone, unarmed, unescorted. She called herself Min Sun. She said she had come from the Moon Circle, an order of female shamans from the far south, a sacred order, ancient, powerful. Min Sun said the order had sent her as an observer, to assess the male shaman, to determine whether his gift was genuine or a deception. Her eyes were dark and inscrutable. She spoke little. She moved silently. Leva told Dan that Min Sun frightened her. Dan said there was nothing to fear. He lied. Min Sun frightened him too. Not because she was physically dangerous, but because he saw nothing in her eyes. No hostility, no curiosity, no fear. Emptiness. The eyes of a person who, since the age of 6, had been told she had no life of her own, that she belonged to the order, that her body, her gift, and her future were tools in the hands of the lunar circle. Dan had seen people like that, in the ambulance, in the emergency room. People who had long since stopped feeling because feeling was too painful. He didn't try to get close to her. He simply treated her like a human being. He greeted her in the morning. He wished her good night in the evening. When she came to the infirmary to observe, he explained what he was doing and why. Not specifically to her. He explained it to Leva and Sana, and Min Sun listened. A week later, she asked her first question. Why did he wash his hands before touching a wound? Dan explained. Invisible creatures live on our hands. They get into the wound and cause it to rot. Soap kills them. Min Sun listened. Then she said that spirits aren't invisible creatures, that spirits are the will of the world. Dan said that might be true, But the will of the world manifests itself through tiny, invisible things that live on hands and in water and in the air. And if you kill those things with soap, the will of the world won't prevent the wound from healing. Min-sun was silent. Then she left. She returned 2 days later. She asked another question, then another. Dan answered, patiently, calmly, as if explaining to a resident. Min-sun wasn't stupid. She was very smart, and her mind had been sharpened by the order like a blade. Sharp, cold, focused. The order hadn't sent her just to observe. Dan knew that. He could feel it. But he couldn't prove it and didn't try. He just kept working. Meanwhile, summer brought another change. Sheila. A trade caravan from Kar Tog arrived at the end of summer. 3 women, a cargo of hides and dried meat, and with them a girl, slender, pale, with sunken eyes, rope marks on her wrists, deep, old. The skin there was red and scarred. Thea brought her to Dan, said that Kar Tog scouts had found her on the southern trail, alone, barefoot, half dead from hunger and thirst. She had been walking from the coast, walking alone, 12 days. The girl's name was Sheila, the daughter of a merchant from the coast, not a slave trader, just an ordinary merchant, who owed money to the wrong person and paid him back with his daughter. Sheila was 19. She had spent 2 years in chains, then she escaped. She didn't say exactly how she escaped. Thea said that Mara was handing Sheila over to Wei Sharon as a sign of peace. Dan examined her. Exhaustion, dehydration, infection on her wrists, bruises on her back, old ones, healed, but the scars would remain forever, and something else. When he reached out to examine the wound on her arm, she recoiled so sharply that she fell off the cot. Her eyes were the eyes of an animal, a cornered one, ready to bite. Dan took 2 steps back, raised his hands, palms forward, just like back then with the first woman wounded in the Orshi plague. Only then, the woman had been afraid of his silver eyes. Sheila, however, was afraid of his hands, his man's hands. He asked Liv to treat the wounds. He stepped out himself. He stood by the wall of the infirmary and breathed. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the ambulance, dozens of times. Victims of violence, victims kidnapping, victims of human trafficking. In Seattle, he'd refer such patients to social workers and psychologists. There were no social workers here, no psychologists, just him. That evening, Sheila was assigned to assist the shaman. Niobe decided. The girl is literate, knows the trade jargon, can do math, a rarity in the Highlands. Let her stay at the infirmary. When Sheila found out she'd been assigned to assist the man, she tried to run away the very first night. Karen caught her, 100 paces from the camp by the stream, brought her back. Sheila didn't struggle, didn't scream. She just stood there, trembling. Dan came to the stream. He sat down on a rock 5 steps away from her, no closer. He didn't say a word. Karen stood nearby, not understanding what was happening. Dan was silent. Sheila was silent. An hour passed. The night wind was cold. 3 moons shone overhead. Sheila sat down on the ground. She wrapped her knees with her hands. Dan sat on the rock. He was silent. Another half-hour passed. Then Sheila spoke, quietly, almost in a whisper. She asked if it was true that he could heal scars. Dan said he could heal the skin. I'll try my best with the rest. Sheila looked at him. For the first time ever, she looked him in the eyes. Then she stood up and walked back to the infirmary. On her own. Dan didn't follow her. He sat by the stream for another 10 minutes. Karen stood nearby. She was silent. Then she said quietly that she didn't know men could be like that. Dan asked what kind. Karen said, quiet ones. Dan said that wasn't silence. It was patience. Thea remained in Wei Sharon as Kar Tog's ambassador. Min-sun from the Moon Circle arrived as an observer and possible spy for the Order. Sheila, a runaway from the coast bearing the marks of slavery, was handed over to Dan for his assistance. She was terrified of men, but after the night by the stream, she began to trust him. Autumn came quickly. The leaves of the red-trunked trees turned even redder. The hot rivers steamed more thickly. The air smelled of rotten earth and something bitter. Dan stood by the infirmary and counted. 8 months had passed since his awakening. During that time, he had performed 1 appendectomy. He had stopped a dysentery epidemic. He had healed over 100 wounded and sick people in 2 tribes. He had introduced quarantine, hygiene, and water boiling. He had built an infirmary. He created a medicine cabinet from 43 herbs. He trained 4 assistants: Leva, Sana, T, and Rohan, a quiet porter with hands of steel who came to the infirmary every evening and learned to bandage with a precision that would make a surgical nurse jealous. Sheila didn't treat. Sheila recorded. After that night by the stream, she came to the infirmary in the morning, silently. She sat in a corner. She watched. 3 days, she asked for birch bark and an ink stick. A week later, she began writing down everything Dan did. Every patient, every treatment, every dosage. Her handwriting was small and neat. She knew the script of the trading coast. Dan taught her his system of record-keeping. She improved it. She added symbols to indicate the type of wound, symbols for herbs, symbols for results. Within a month, they had a real card index. Sheila kept it in a leather pouch and wouldn't let anyone touch it. It was her work, her place, her worth. Dan saw how her face changed, how the fear faded from her sunken eyes, how something new took its place. Not confidence yet, but a foothold, a point of ground to stand on. She still flinched when he raised his hand too quickly, still wouldn't let him come closer than 2 steps. But she came to the infirmary every morning, and every evening she was the last to leave. One October morning, a scout ran into the camp. Tala, soaked from the rain, out of breath. She said 2 words. Orhun is coming. Niobe assembled the council in 10 minutes, Tala reported. A slave trader caravan spotted on the northern trail. 30 men, crossbows, dogs, heading for Wei Sharan. A 3-day journey. Niobe turned to Dan. He was ready. He had been preparing for 6 months. The pit traps had been dug a month ago. Sharpened stakes at the bottom. Camouflaged. Signal fires were set up at 4 points. Scout sentries were in position. The cave shelter was prepared. A supply of bandages, needles, thread, clean water, honey, salt. A poppy decoction for pain relief. Everything was in place. Niobe had sent a messenger to Kartog. An agreement, mutual aid. Thea had volunteered to run. She was fast. The fastest of anyone Dan knew in this world. She left at dawn. Dan spent 2 days preparing. He moved the entire supply of medicines into the cave. He set up a field hospital, 6 cots, torches, a pot for boiling water, instruments. Leva and Sana helped. Rohan hauled stones and hides. Sheila sat in the corner of the cave with a bag of birch bark notes pressed to her chest, counting bandages. Min-sun stood at the cave entrance, watching silently. Dan approached her. He asked if she would stay. Min-sun was silent. Then she said the order had sent her to observe, not to fight. Dan said he didn't need her to fight. He needed her to help in the hospital. Min-sun asked why she should help a tribe that wasn't hers. Dan said there were no tribes in the hospital. There were only the wounded. Min-sun was silent for a long time. Then she said she would think about it. On the 3rd day, T returned. With her were 20 Kartog warriors. Ranga led them personally. The one-eyed female warrior leader with an arm that had already healed. She looked at Dan and said she had come to repay a debt. Niobe and Ranga stood side by the main fire and discussed a defense plan. Karen leads the archers to the northern ridge. First line, pitfalls will slow down the attackers. Arrows will thin the ranks. Second line, Wei Sharan spearwomen around the camp perimeter. Third line, Kartog warriors on the southern flank. Reserve. Dan is in the cave with the infirmary. Orhun arrived at night, just as Dan had predicted, with snow. The first snow of autumn, wet and heavy, with dogs. Dan heard their barking from a distance. Then the first signal fire flared up in the north. A minute later, a second one. The camp woke up. Niobe stood in the center with a spear, giving orders. Her voice was steady, clear. She had been doing this for 20 years. The children and the elderly were led into the cave. Shera ran alongside Dan. She held his hand and didn't cry. She was the chieftain's daughter. She knew what a night was like when strangers came. Dan settled into the cave. He laid out his tools. He lit the torches. Leva and Sana were nearby. Rohan stood at the entrance. Sheila was in the corner with her notes. Minsun stood by the wall. She had come. She didn't say a word. She just came. The first wounded were brought in an hour later. 2 female warriors, crossbow bolts, one in the shoulder, the other in the thigh. Dan got to work. He pulled the bolt out of the shoulder, bleeding, heavy. He pinched the artery with his fingers. He shouted to Leva to hand him a bone clamp. Leva handed it to him. His hands didn't tremble. He bandaged the wound, stopped the bleeding. The second warrior, a bolt in her thigh, deep, close to the femoral artery. If it's damaged, she'll die in minutes. He carefully widened the wound, found the tip, near the artery, not in it, pulled it out. Blood flowed, but not pulsating, not arterial. Bandaged it. A tight bandage. A tourniquet above the wound. Next. Another one. Another. The night was long. The wounded kept coming. Dan worked. His hands were covered in blood up to his elbows, not his own. Leva handed him instruments. Sana changed bandages. Rohan carried the wounded from the entrance to the cots. Sheila counted and took notes. And Minsun. Minsun stood by the wall for the first hour, the second hour. On the third hour, when they brought in a teenage girl with a laceration on her side from dog teeth, Minsun stepped forward, silently. She knelt down next to Dan. She looked at the wound, then at him. He said, "Hold it here." She pressed the edges of the wound together. Her hands were slender and unexpectedly strong. He stitched. She held. Then he said, "Wash it." She washed it with boiled water, just as she had seen in the infirmary. They worked together for the rest of the night, without words. Their hands did what needed to be done. Before dawn, they brought in Niobe. Karen carried her on her shoulders. The red-haired spearwoman was covered from head to toe in someone else's blood and her own. A cut on her forehead, abrasions. But she was standing. Niobe was conscious. The arrow had gone through her left thigh. Entry wound in the front, exit wound in the back. The bleeding was moderate, not arterial. Dan snapped off the shaft, pulled out the rest of the arrow, rinsed the wound, stitched it up, bandaged it. Niobe lay there and looked at him, without looking away. Her eyes were cloudy with pain and exhaustion. She opened her mouth and said a name. Not Diane, not Torishan. Daniel, his real name. Dan froze. He had never told anyone here his real name. Never, not a single person. He looked at her. She closed her eyes and lost consciousness. He stood there with a needle in one hand and a piece of cloth in the other, unable to move. Then Leva touched his shoulder and he went back to work. Orhun attacked at night with 30 mercenaries. The Kartogs came to the rescue. Dan worked in the field hospital all night. Minsun made her choice and stood beside him, helping to treat the wounded. Niobe was struck by an arrow in the thigh, and before losing consciousness, she called Dan by his real name, the one he had never told anyone. Dawn. The snow was red. Dan stumbled out of the cave on unsteady legs. 3 days without sleep. 27 wounded had passed through his hands that night. He had lost 4. 23 had survived. He stood at the cave entrance, breathing in the cold air. His hands were covered in dried blood. His eyes burned from exhaustion and smoke. It was quiet all around. The battle was over. Karen approached him. She was limping. A bandage on her left thigh, blood on her face, not hers. She said Orhun was dead. Niobe had killed him. With a spear in the back. Right at the entrance to the shaman's hut where he had broken in with 2 mercenaries. He had come for Dan, personally, because they paid triple for a living man. A shaman paid triple. But Dan wasn't there. Dan was in the cave, and in the hut there was only an empty cot and a dying fire. Orkhan turned and saw Niobe, a woman with an arrow in her hip who had walked through 2 courtyards across snow and blood to stand between him and the one she was protecting. Karen said that Niobe had said 3 words to him before the blow. "He's ours." Dan closed his eyes, then opened them, asked how many of the Weisharan had lost. Karen said 8 were killed, 4 were in the hospital whom he couldn't save, 12 in total. Of Orkhan's 30 mercenaries, 6 remained alive. They surrendered at dawn when they saw their commander was dead. The pit traps took 5 in the first few minutes. Karen's arrows from the ridge took 7 more. The rest were finished off by the spearwomen and the Kartog warriors in hand-to-hand combat. Ranga lost 2 of her own. She was standing over the body of one of them when Dan stepped out onto the square. She raised her head, looked at him, nodded. Once. Just like back then during the negotiations, only now there was something different in that nod. Acknowledgement. She turned to her warriors and led them back to camp. Dan crossed the square. The camp looked like it had been hit by a hurricane. 2 yurts had burned down, the pen was destroyed, the goats had scattered, the snow was trampled by hundreds of feet and stained with blood. The mercenaries' bodies lay where they had fallen. They would be removed later. Right now, the living were more important. Shira ran up and wrapped her arms around his waist. She wasn't crying. She pressed herself against him and stood that way until he put his hand on her head. His fingers were covered in blood. He pulled his hand away, wiped it on his pants, put it back. Clean. Shira looked up and said that Mom was hurt. Dan said he knew, that her mother would live. Shira nodded and ran off toward the cave. He went back to work. Another day. He checked on every wounded person, changed the bandages, cleaned the wounds. Niobe was conscious, pale, weak, but conscious. She lay on the animal skins in the cave and watched him as he changed her bandage. She didn't repeat his name, didn't explain how she knew it, just watched. And he didn't ask, not now. There were more important things. On the 3rd day after the battle, when the wounded were stable and the dead had been burned on the funeral pyre, Niobe came out of the cave, on a pole, with her hip bandaged. Her face was gray with pain, but she stood. She always stood. The tribe gathered in the square, all that remained of it. 338 people, minus 12. Niobe leaned on her spear. She spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual, but everyone heard it. She said that Weisharan stood, that the enemy was dead, that the alliance with Kartog had brought victory, and that all of this had been made possible because 8 months ago, at the Council of Elders, a boy with silver eyes had risen from his knees and looked her in the face. She turned to Dan. He was standing at the edge of the square, in dirty clothes, with dark circles under his eyes, with hands that still smelled of blood and honey. Niobe said that from this day forward, his name was not the male shaman. His name was Daniel of Silver, and he was Weisharan, not a slave, not a guest, not a tool. Weisharan, one of their own. She turned to the tribe. And 338 people, men and women, warriors and porters, old and young. For the first time in Isanur's history, they all bowed their heads before a man at the same time. The silence was so thick that Dan could hear the snow falling. He stood and looked at them, at these people, at Orsha, who had bowed her gray head, her lips moving in prayer, at Karin, who stood on one knee with a spear pressed to her chest, her red hair wet from the melting snow, at Liv and Sana, who stood side by side, both crying, at Rohan, who bowed lower than anyone else, his broad shoulders shaking, at Thea, who stood among the Kar warriors, Tog, and also bowed her head, at Sheila, who stood in the cave entrance with a bag of records and did not bow her head because she didn't know how, but her eyes were wet, at Minson, who stood motionless by the wall, and for the first time ever, her face was not blank. There was something on it, a choice. And on Shira, who didn't bow, who ran up to him and hugged him around the waist, tilted her head back, and said loudly for the whole square to hear, "This is my brother." Dan stood there. Snow fell on his hair, on his shoulders, on his hands, which had saved 23 lives and lost 4. He thought in clear English, quietly, to himself. One sentence. Mom, I think I found a new shift. The battle ended in victory. Orkone was killed by Niobe. The Weisharan lost 12 men. Before the entire tribe, Niobe gave Dan the name Daniel of Silver and recognized him as a full member of the Weisharan. For the first time in the history of Isanur, the tribe bowed their heads before a man. A year had passed. The first spring after the battle with Orkone was warm and early. The snow had melted in 2 weeks. The hot rivers had swollen and were steaming so that the highlands were shrouded in fog until noon every day. The red-trunked trees were in bloom, scarlet flowers the size of a palm. Dan stood at the edge of the camp and looked at them. A year ago, he had been on his knees in a stone hall, not knowing if he would live to see the morning. Now he was standing on his own 2 feet. On his own 2 feet. In his own camp. Among his own people. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.